I think it's time to start. Let's just get going. So, um, last time, you found yourselves in this world, this dark place with buildings going up on all sides. And as you find yourself walking the streets, the same place, something seems rather different this time. Not particular, it's just a little bit. And you realize it doesn't seem as foggy. Still these giant grey buildings going on the sides, everything is very, very dark and very nuanced in the very, very vague bits of colors that can be found. But interestingly enough, within the sky, you can see these flashes of bright, bright white light. Kind of like glinting stars, just every now and then popping up through what seems to be less fog today. Smog seems to be further up into the atmosphere. It's not so encroaching. And similarly to the last time that you were here, you can still hear these forms of construction noises in the background, just enveloping your eardrums, but just very barely, at the limit of that which is audible to you. Somehow it seems familiar. The lights, you're sure that you've experienced this before, but you're not sure where or why. And try as you might, it's not reaching you. And something is quite beautiful about them, and something feels foreboding. You feel like something's happening, and you don't know what. Pushing those thoughts aside, you make your way forward. You walk down the streets, at this point down a familiar path of streets, getting you to a familiar little wooden hut with no roof, with a shoddy door skewed slightly at an angle, and firelight glinting out from between the cracks. As you open the door, you realize there's less people here today. It's fairly empty today, although Soren Lestrade is sitting there, across from the fire as usual, stoking it just very barely. Doesn't want it to become too large, but it needs to make sure it doesn't die either. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. Come on in. The skylights are back. Well, we'll see what that means, I suppose. Guess they hope they miss my hut again this year. He ushers you in, and as you close the door behind you, and you sit down, you find, that the benches are a slight bit further together today. Maybe to help with the amount of, with the fewer number of people, or maybe to simply have it a bit cozier today. It doesn't feel colder than other days, but it's nice to be by the fire. Alright, I don't want to waste too much time here. Let's go within ourselves again. Close your eyes. Take a moment for yourself. Breathe. And as he says that, you finish the breath and you open your eyes. You're back. You're back into the forest of bottles. The inch-thick layer of water over what feels like just dark ground that is the same color as everything else around you. Very familiar feeling at this point. One thing is rather strange today, though, as the bottles are hanging around you everywhere. You realize that they're all at a slight tilt. Just very, very barely, and as you realize that, you also realize that it's not the bottles that are at a tilt, but they're hanging normally. The floor is tilted. I'm not sure why. Thorin comes up and he looks around and he gives a brief laugh. This happens sometimes. I'll explain it another time. It's a fun effect. Be ready for it when it happens again. This world likes to do strange things every now and then. Looking around, you see many of the bottles that you had seen in the previous times. Some of them, they seem to be rearranged, as the ones that you had come to know, the one with the desert, the glass city, Ruminara. These ones, some of them are still visible, and some of the ones that you normally recognize aren't there. And instead you can see new bottles. They seem to have shifted or flipped or moved. This is the world's way of telling us I want other stories sometimes. But I think today we have a bit of a story to complete. I think, at least for now, we'll return to Ruminara, and I'm sure we'll visit all of these lovely, lovely bottles eventually. But for today we're going here. As he picks up the bottle again, by now very, very familiar. Now, though, you notice that there seem to be two lights, two very brief glints coming from within the bottle. One light for each of the stories. How about we add a third one? As he hands you the bottle. I believe you know what to do. Take the bottle, you hold it for a moment, just looking inside, grasped within your hand. You uncork it. And as you uncork it, this sensation, it grips you every time. It suctions you, and you feel yourself shrinking and being moved into the bottle. And falling down through the bottle, you get the same feeling again, as looking outside, you can see yourself still holding the bottle. And for a moment you exist in both places, as you're watching yourself both fall into the bottle and watching yourself hold it. And then the moment vanishes, and you feel yourself falling before you, as you once again see the vivid landscape of Ruminara. Far below you, the beautiful greens and reds and blues and yellows, the wonderful browns of the mountains and the whites of their peaks, and the greens of these massive forest areas, and the verdant blue of the sea. And it looks peaceful. For a while, it looks like every other time you've seen it, until you realize that it's slightly different. And it's not entirely clear why it's different now. You try to think it over, and you're not sure why it's different. Something about the southern coastline feels off, as if it's different from before. But you're not sure. And at that moment that you're thinking about what might be different, you don't have the time anymore, as you begin falling again. It brings you downward and downward until, once again, you fall to a point where you're hovering over one smaller portion, the peninsula of Noom. And overlaid over the beautiful greens and the blues and the mountains and the fields, you see this map with names, several pathways drawn into it. You've become very used to it at this point. This is something you've felt a few times now, and strange as this overlay might be, it's like seeing something through two different sets of eyes, and they kind of just exist on top of each other, but depending on which one you focus on, you can see whichever one you want to see. Welcome back to Noom. Maybe we should recap a little bit of what's happened before, so that those who might be new here know what they're getting into. Here in Noom, we're following the story of a dwarf by the name of Baeran, as he begun with no name. Through his first adventure, his smaller one, as he got lost within the plains of Mord and found the stone flutes, gained his first name, Baeran Windtamer. And then as he gained this, came home to find his family gone, and the looks of a fairly large raid, or potentially even a war on the horizon. And with this, he found and saved another dwarf woman, brought her back to her hometown, and there allied himself with a group known as the Circle of Thanes. They sent him on a brief quest to try and find evidence of a specific magical artifact. The Stormwind set. A powerful set of armor said to have been worn by the goddess Ashtola herself. He went on his journey. He returned to the Plains of Mord to find the stone flutes because he felt like the magic of the wind might help him forward. Wind and storms, it seemed, connected to him, and as he found it, and he revealed the secrets of the stones, he found the magical aura of the wind emblazoned and tattooed on his arm up to his shoulder. And with that, Baeran took his things, and he began his trek and journey back, taking a moment when he was outside to pray to Ashtola in her many forms. The story begins with Baeran, as he is once again on the path, choosing to move left or to move right, to return to his hometown or to return to the outpost. And for a moment he's tempted to go back home. But just for a moment, because as he thinks about it, he realizes there's nothing there. He's not going to find anything. And with a heavy heart he turns. And he walks, makes his way to the outpost. It takes him a little while. Just under a day of travel away, makes his way, and the sun's sinking, and within that orange glow eventually he turns the crest of the hill, and he finds ahead of him the wooden palisade of the Stoutmire outpost. He walks up, and the guards look at him, and they're... For a moment it seems like they don't want to let him in because they don't recognize him, but then he takes off his hat and he shows his face better, and a brief moment of recognition appears, and they open the gates for him. He walks in, past all of the huts. For a moment he stops in the middle of the central thoroughfare, looking off to his right to see the medicine hut that he'd seen Ildra get carried into the previous, several days ago. And he thinks for a moment of going over there as he contemplates, and then decides against it. And he goes up to the main long hut. He opens the doors, the smell of meats and smoked hickory and just, in general, smoke just wafting his way, and for a moment making his eyes tear a bit. So he shakes it off and he walks in, his eyes adjusting to the darkness within. He looks up and he sees that not all of the Thanes are there. 3 of them still seem to be there. 1 female Thane and 2 male, as they sit around a fire, possibly bickering about something, possibly just being dwarves. It's hard to tell. As he walks up, I've returned. I found some things. I have some knowledge. Maybe it can help. The Thanes look up for a moment, contemplating whether just to continue the bickering, because they're Thanes, it's what they do. But then as they see, as Baeran walks in, he has these tattoos all over his arm, and they see that things have changed, and they drop it. The woman stands up and walks up to him. Very well, what have you found? Do we need to get the other Thanes, or is this more of a smaller kind of thing? Baeran thinks about it. I think we should get the other Thanes. I think it's important. Maybe one of the other Thanes knows more about this than I do. The lady sighs. Very well, they're not gonna like this. Why are they so stubborn? She says, as Baeran knows in his mind that she's just as much as stubborn as every single one of the other ones. But she gets up. For a moment, she seems to consider going out herself. And then she talks to the other Thanes, and she's like, one of you go, I can't be bothered with this, and then they begin bickering all over again. Until they seem to agree on that they should just play a game. With their hands, they do this brief motion. Two of them shout cheerfully as the third one, as he gets up and he's like, I should have known. You're a pain in the ass, says, and he walks out the door to get the other Thanes. The lady comes over to Baeran again, and he takes him over and... Well, sit down, have some dinner. You look like you haven't had much meat in the past days. I'm of the dual Karg. I am Thane Lavi. I don't know if you've heard of us. We're from fairly far north. Might be new to you. And true to that, Baeran hadn't heard of the name before. But he figured that if she was here in this circle, chances were that it wasn't a small clan. And as he sat, he thanked her for the food. He dove in, ripping off chunks of what seemed like roasted lamb. Or, yeah, probably sheep. And as he ate a bit, eventually the other things trickled in until all six of them were there. And then the advisor came in as well. The dwarf with the long beard, the overseer of the outpost. Well, what have you? Said one of the other dwarven thanes. Why do you have to interrupt us? I was happy sitting in my bed and getting a mellow buzz on. And looking up, Baeran could tell that the mellow buzz was probably 4 or 5 full tankards of ale. Dwarves. The way they are. Baeran put his plate aside, waved his hands a little bit, and then he revealed the shoulder. So I made my way into the plains of Mord, and I found, well, a lot of, this is previously, I found these strange stone flutes that are there. Perhaps you know something about them, and they, within the center of this circle of stones, is this large monolith, and it had a bunch of strange runes on it. And so what I'd gone there was to learn more about it. I figured I had recognized some of the runes as runes for wind, and I thought maybe that had something to do with it, so I went and I did something, and now the runes are all over my arm. I'm not entirely sure. If something I did worked, I plan to take a bit of time and learn these and potentially put them on an armor, and I hope that that'll help. I hope that'll perhaps be the first step in the Stormwind. The other things kind of just stood there and they nodded a bit. Well, off you go, get on with it. We don't have that much time. Baeran, by the abruptness, they was a little bit shocked. He wasn't sure why. I mean, they just called the Thanes here. He figured somebody would have something to say to it, but none of the Thanes seemed to want to say anything about it. Half of them continued back into the previous game that they were playing, and the ones that hadn't were... Well, 2 of them had tankards. One of them looked like he had a sleeping cap on. Well, get on with it. I don't know, we don't have anything for you. You're the Forge Master here, not us. The Thanes kind of just shove him out the door with their words, and then proceed with whatever they were doing with the evening. And as Baeran stood there, he wondered, and he wasn't sure where to start, really. He figured probably the place to start would just be to forge something? Stood in the center of the thoroughfare again, and he wondered what to do. Before him was several possibilities, and he'd have to take one of them, but he wasn't sure what. He had either the option to try and use the things that he had at his disposal here. He could try making armor out of leather, seeing if he could emboss it on the hardened leather. Something about that didn't feel entirely right. But the only other option would be for him to go home, make a plate set with the steel that they had there, to emboss it on the steel. And as he stood there for a moment, he looked around and he saw the huts. He saw the place that he had stayed and he saw the medicine hut. And he wanted to stay. At the same time, he also kind of knew that he probably wouldn't do it as well if he stayed here. Went home, he could look at the journals. He could get the steel. So the first question is, what does he do? Does he stay to make it out of studded armor, studded leather? Or does he go back home to use plate? He's about a day's travel. He'd leave early in the morning the next day, and then he'd arrive there late afternoon, evening-ish. Alright, unless I see any other comments, I'm going to go for the plate. Alright. And as Baeran thinks about it, he realizes that much as he'd like to stay, he knows that he needs the things from home. He's forged a few things on the way, and he could probably make something decent out of things here, but he knew that what he was making wasn't something decent. It had to be something powerful. So he set himself up, walked around, he went to the medicine hut, and he kind of peeked in through the door, only to his disappointment to see that the room was empty. Somewhere in his mind hoping that maybe he'd see Ildra before he left. But with a bit of a heavy heart and a bit of a wondering what had happened to her, whether she was already up and about again. He trudged along and he made his way back to the little hut that he had went to. Set his things down. And he went to bed, ready to get up with the break of dawn, make his way home. Packed a few things to the side, made sure his rations were completed so that he had enough for the path, for the travel. And then with that, he went to sleep. And his dreams were vivid. Most times he can't remember dreaming anything. He figures most of the time it just passes over him and then enters one ear and leaves the other pretty much. But he has these vivid flashes in his mind of mostly colors, and as he tries to focus on these flashes of reds and oranges and yellows, very barely within each flash he feels like he can see someone. It's hard to tell. He can't tell the details. He's not sure. But he's sure. He's dreaming about someone, but he doesn't know who or who they are. It seems to be multiple. And eventually he wakes up and he's completely confused. He has no idea. But looks out the window and he sees the sun rising and he realizes that he doesn't have the time to think too much about this. It's a dream. What can it mean? So he packs up his stuff. He gets his things together. He sets out. The travel back to his home is fairly uneventful at this point. He's gone it often enough now to know the path and to know that nothing really is over here. He's also behind. He's behind the outpost line, so he doesn't expect to meet up with any resistance, with any stragglers from potentially another clan, because they'd have to have gone past the outpost to get here. Not particularly worried. He travels home, makes his way along. And much as expected, nothing particularly happens. Although he does realize that with each passing step, his mood just perpetually just drops further and further as the day begun sunny, and then fairly quickly clouds rolled in from over the ocean, and then with the clouds came this incessantly annoying drizzle. This continued for the entire day, and it's not like a downpour. A downpour can be satisfying sometimes, but no, it was this annoying mix of a drizzle and just this wet mist, which just seeped through every single piece of clothing that he had, and just made him just barely cold enough that it was frustrating. And with each step, that combined with the fact that he was going home to a place where no one was, kind of set his mind on edge. He had things to do there, he knew, but he didn't really want to go necessarily. But as late afternoon eventually rolled over, traveled past the foothills, made his way to the coast, and there along the coastal cliffs, he saw, now completely drenched and pretty sleepy, it felt like, the huts of his home. And he walked back in. He looked around, and realizing he hadn't done this the last time in his fear and in his anxiety, he took the time this time. He dug some shallow graves for the few that had fallen. Then he buried them, he made small mounds, and for each of them he set a small prayer to Ashtola, the hearth, to keep them safe. Within the center of the village, set up in a bit of a circular fashion, as you walk in, there's the central place and a smaller longhouse, kind of similar to the one at the outpost, but much thinner. And around it were just kind of the huts of the forge masters, and several of the forges themselves, two of them out in the open, one underneath a thatched roof. And you looked around and it felt so familiar, and it felt so sad when it was this empty. He sighed for a moment. He went forward to the longhouse and he opened the doors. And he was expecting what he had always gotten his whole life. But he'd open the doors and it would be this hickory smoke, and it would be this smell of cooking pot of potatoes, or meats, leeks, onions, something. But as he opened the door inside, it smelled just like outside. It smelled like wet earth. It smelled empty to him. And with that, not daring to walk inside of the long hut, he took a step back and he closed the door again, instead choosing to do only what he came here for. Not choosing to find things or to look around. He figured that it was too painful, he couldn't do it. So he went to his own home, and not touching any of the pieces that were around, he went to the working room of his father, the forge master, and going through some of the things, he found a journal on steelworking. He had come for that, to make sure that he used the right techniques, that he had the right utensils and pieces. And as he got all the pieces together, he got much of the metal that he could find from around the village. He began to heat one of the forges as he lit it up, and then he began pressing the bellows over and over until he had this massive roaring flame within the kiln. And it made him a bit happy, because for the first time again, there was fire within the village again. Something was alive, even if it was flames. He pressed the bellows and he pressed the bellows, and eventually when he realized, when the flame of the kiln was hot enough, closed the gate, letting it simmer a bit, preparing the rest of the steel, and set it into the forge. Let it melt, and he began shaping the metal. He began creating a full set of plate armor. Shoulder pads, arms, rivulets, greaves, sabatons. Wonderful plate going across the breast. And he formed it in his own stature. What he knew best to do. He figured it might be a bit small for one of the other things, but he could adjust that when he got there. That wasn't his worry. So he tempered the steel, and he created it. And once he had made a full set of armor, one that he was happy with, he rested for a bit. It takes a long time to forge steel this way. It took him a few days. And each night he had been plagued by nightmares. In some ways similar to the dream that he had just before leaving, but often now these lights were cold and blue purples, and he couldn't tell who was within it, but he got this crushing, bearing sensation on himself. And he wasn't sure why. He didn't know who these were. He didn't know why they were here, what they were doing in his mind. The only thing that seemed to be able to keep him happy at the moment was forging. Felt like something he'd always done, and Timmy was so mindless. His brain was just somewhere completely different when he did it. And as he tempered and as he created, he had the steel. Then he took the time, he got some pages from within his own house. He began writing down a lot of the runes, the way that they had engraved themselves on his arm, as he wrote them down in conjecture with the runes around them, as he created this map spread across several pages, this sweeping, weaving map of the tattoos on his arm. As he had written that down, he took out pieces that seemed familiar, and he took out the way that they were, and he laid out the map in such a way that it would, same as on the paper, sweep across the breastplate, go up past the shoulder, down the back, sweep around, and then over the greaves. And he began hammering it in, embossing the center of the center of the breastplate, and then moving up to the shoulder and around. And as he did this, once each piece was finished, he would polish it. He'd carefully put it aside on a hanger for an armor rack that he had at home. Or probably more accurately, his father had, for exactly this sort of thing. And once again, a day, 2, 3 days later, he had finished it. And in front of him, he saw this not necessarily ornate set. In a lot of ways, it was simply a plate armor, one that he'd made before, of a kind. Sturdy, strong, very dwarven. Very much exactly the way he'd wanted it to be. He didn't want it to be fancy or unique or emblazoned in any way with gems and with feathers and furs and who knows what. It didn't feel right here. But all across it were these runes, the same ones as the ones that he had on his arm. And he felt very content with it, the way that it was. And as he completed it, he stood back and he looked at it. And that moment of looking at this was the moment his mind fell apart. As grief hit home and he felt the longing for his family, all of the pieces he had done, he was doing this for them, it felt like. He wanted this because he wanted to succeed, he wanted to get them back, and as he did that, ever further this thought of that he might get them back was drifting further and further away, until at this point he felt like it was impossible. To get what felt like a semblance of warmth, strangely enough, he put on the cold steel. Because even within it, cold as the steel was, it felt the warmth of that he had done this for himself, for his family. He had done it with the knowledge of his clan. Without them, he couldn't have done it. And it connected him to them, he felt like. It was special. Wasn't sure whether he could give it to someone else. Whether he'd have to wear this himself. As It felt unique to him, and it felt like this was his way of dealing with the loss that he'd felt so far. As he felt this, for the briefest moment, in his mind he saw, once again, these flashing oranges, reds, and yellows, and then counteracted by the flashing blues and purples, and as they mingled and melded, creating this rainbow of flashing colors within his eyes and his face, and he clenched his eyes together and then opened them to see that very slightly the runes on his arm were radiating blue. And he looked up his arm and he saw the shoulder, and the runes on the armor were radiating the same blue as some connection to the rest of his being. It wrapped around his torso, down his legs, and he felt it worked. He had the wind on his armor. He took that moment. He kept the armor on. And then with that, with the briefest bit of hope that maybe the magic of this armor, while not his, could maybe help him, took the pieces, and he brought them with him, and he made his way. Made his way back to the Stoutmire outpost. This time the day's travel was nicer. It was better. It was sunny, it felt hopeful. It was very slightly cloudy, so as not to have the sun burning down at all times. It was an incredibly pleasant day. Wonderful. And as he arrived, once again, later afternoon, at the outpost, came back, took off the helmet, let the guard see him as they opened the gate for him. And as he walked in, ready to prepare and show his things for the Thanes, heard very faintly over the hills the sound of a horn blaring. He heard what sounded like extremely distant rolling thunder. And everything stood still for a moment. Just for a moment, as he realized that this was what he had created the armor for. This was the beginning. The beginning of something large that he was probably not able to stop anymore. This was the beginning of a war, and those were the sounds of hundreds of footfalls across the hills. And as he was having that thought, he heard the door to the longhouse slam open, all of the Thanes come out, and behind them, he saw the older man, but this time dressed differently. The older dwarf had these long priest-like garbs on, and strapped across his back was this huge banner. And for that moment of wondering, it didn't take long for Baeran to realize that, and as he was about to finish the thought, he saw the old dwarf pull out a horn and blasted it within the center of the thoroughfare. He was sure that everyone within a 20-kilometer radius must have heard the thing. And he realized that this was the sound for war. This was the sound they were making to get everyone together for battle, to mobilize the troops. And while this outpost didn't have all of them, he knew that that horn sound was loud enough to reach all of the further encampments that were probably just over the hills, of all of the clans preparing for this moment, preparing to dye the hills red with blood. Thanes walked up to Baeran. "I don't think there's enough time anymore," Baeran said. "I don't think I can give this to anyone else." And the Thanes looked at him. And Lavi, the one that he had talked to previously, looked at him, and she smiled a bit, and she said, "I don't think you should give it to anyone else. That looks like yours. If you would join us, we have a certain battle plan. I feel like the way to do it is you should be our herald. With this armor, You walk forward. You join the main force, and let everyone see the power of steel. There were several tactical discussions, and Baeran didn't understand a lot of it. He didn't understand the pieces of the flanking. He didn't understand the way that the troops were being deployed. He knew that there was most likely a lot of reason to it, but it escaped him. He wasn't sure how it worked. He tried to learn bits and pieces. He learned about the functions of different areas, that there was the vanguard that would run forward, meet the opposing force head first to create them occupied, to make them occupied, so that at that point the flanks would come around the sides, and then once a full battle had engaged, then he, as part of the main strike force, would split through the center where there was a weakness and drive their way home to defeat the opponent's king. That was what he had gotten. He was sure there was more nuance to it, but it missed him. But he did that. He joined up with the elite guard, and together all of them, fully studded in plate, made their way up the hills, and standing atop a hill, could see barely on the other side, maybe a little under a kilometer away, you could see on top of another hill a group, and around them this mass of creatures, dwarves, as they swarmed down the hills, jogging slowly, making their way into the valley where the battle was to be held. It was a relatively strategic point for both sides. One side had the advantage of being able to retreat, the other side had the advantage of a higher ground on the leftmost flank. Gave them an advantage in trying to press an attack in from the side, using the movement and just energy that troops would have coming down the hills to try and drive the enemy backwards. And I watched as the vanguards engaged. He watched as the flanks came in, and as he had seen previously as well, as he was expecting, the left flank was stronger for the opponent. As they drove inward, and he saw a bit of weakness approaching. And at that point he saw it happen. He saw two things. There was the king, or the so-called king of the Highlands, Aisgerd Morog, leader of the Dul Morog, coming around ready to take advantage of this break in the formation on the side. But what he hadn't noticed, and what Baeran saw from this position, that just barely past the left flank, his own units had created this portion with a bit of a break. Just enough to break through with a wedge of units. Baeran rallied the elite guard. He called to them around him, and he said, "We have our position, this is the way to go." And he began running. He didn't wait for anyone else. He began running, he began yelling, whisking up the whistling axe around him to create this keening sound, to drive any foes away that would stand against him. And then he began singing old folk songs that his parents had taught him, that he'd learned from the many elders of the clan when he was still younger. He began singing strong and fearlessly, going for this moment to try and bring back this livelihood from his childhood, mixing it together with the horrors of this battle, trying to grant himself strength with it. And as he was singing, he felt something happen. The runes on his arm lit up, runes across the side and then the back and the chest plate of his armor lit up. And then as the blue pulsed lightly, he saw a brief crackle of electricity go up his arm and then pass down the shoulder. And he felt as steel itself seemed to shift slightly, as it grew and took form underneath his singing. And as he was running and singing, and he didn't take too much notice of it, but around him, this energy, this electricity, bundled up and started statically creasing around him and the armor seemed to meet it as it got these jagged spikes coming off the sides and towards the back as the steel shaped itself to the electricity and the magic that was going through it. And the Vanguard clashed. His main strike force drove a wedge into the enemies until, for a moment, as he slashed and he took hits and he had several wounds on his legs across his side, and one nasty scar that went down past his eye, but it didn't matter to him. He knew what he was doing. This was where he had to be. By what felt like divine hand, he felt himself guided forward and straight, as leaving through one opponent, not realizing that that was the last one he'd faced directly like that, came forward, and in front of him stood Isgard, Thane of Dul Morog, so-called King of the Highlands. At this point, Baeran took out the whistling axe and he held it aloft, and opposite him, the king for a moment was confused. He didn't understand how this had happened. He had the upper hand for a moment, and here this character in electrically charged armor was standing before him with a strange axe that was making weird whistling sounds. But it didn't matter to him as Isgard pulled from behind him massive two-handed claymore. The claymore didn't have that much of a guard. Instead, what it looked like these claws holding it, and within it this dull reddish blade swept upwards. Isgard growled at Baeran. He held the sword forward, and he was prepared. And the moment that they clashed was intense. This crashing sound of steel on steel, as Baeran could feel that this axe that he had made was not strong enough. He was potentially not strong enough to be able to deal with a two-handed sword. The weight of Isgard's strikes were so powerful, and he realized that this was a dwarf that had much more combat experience than he did. Baeran was standing here, and he had been driven here. He knew that this was the thing to do, but as he was here now, he did not have the combat experience to fight this. Around him, the elite guard were dealing with his opponent's guard. He didn't have help here. This was his fight. Nobody was going to help him. If he lost, that was it. Taking strength from that, Baeran shouted, and he continued yelling this song as the electricity went up his arm and into the axe that he was wielding. As he slashed it backwards and forwards, interesting things happened. As the wind piping through it, instead of making this whistling, started making this staticky electricity that would just drift past it, as these sweeps of lightning would happen. And at this point, Isgard had to move backwards a bit, as his strikes with the blade, while they were strong, he wasn't getting through, and strong as he might be, he was still fearful of magic, fearful of lightning striking him. But around him, his people were winning. He could do this. Isgard lifted the sword, ready for a large upper hand swing that Baeran wouldn't be able to deal with. At which point, it seemed to freeze. For a moment, Baeran saw the battlefield around him. He couldn't move. He saw what was about to happen. He knew that his axe wouldn't be able to stop this. It would break. And then for a moment within his mind's eye, clouded over, he hears a voice. This strange voice speaking an extremely old dwarven tongue, almost hard to recognize. It speaks to him in three female voices, soprano, alto, and a mezzosopran, as they layer over each other, and he creates this intense sound, and he knows what it is. He's read legends, the three voices of Ashtola sounding within him. And before him, for a moment, she shows him a path. the one path forward that he can swing it around, and if he hits with his axe just barely at the right point, he can do one of two things. And here we have the option. Either Baeran can go to disarm, or he can use the power of Ashtola instead. So either he can use the path she shows him, the victory, or he can use the magic that's coursing through him. What does he do? A bit tricky to decide, isn't it? Anybody else want to weigh in on it? You should follow the path of the gods. Alright, then seeing this path to victory, Baeran swings it around, and harnessing the lightning just barely to increase his speed just a bit, strikes forward and smashes the front of his axe into the back of the gauntlet that Iceguard's holding. And it doesn't break through it, but it crushes the center into his hand, and and Iceguard, while swinging downward, is forced to let the blade fall from his grip. And as the blade falls, Baeran swirls his axe around, and for a moment, he's ready to strike, kill the Dwarven King, when something grasps him. He feels some effect stopping him from moving as he's paralyzed for a moment, and Iceguard looks up at him. In his face, a mixture of terror, of fury, of pride. And then this creeping smile comes up as Iceguard, knowing he doesn't have too much time, calls retreat and runs. All across the battlefield, the horns start blaring as Iceguard sounds a full retreat. And as his units disconnect and they make their way back, fleeing from whoever's still passing, the Thanes call their own horns, making sure not to follow too far, because on both sides, many were lost. And as Baeran looks around, he sees many dead. The entire valley is cluttered, littered with corpses, and he wonders how many have died here today. He looks down, and at his feet, sees the blade. Sees the massive claymore that Iceguard had been using. Baeran picks it up, feels it in his hand, and for a moment he can feel this thrumming go through his hand as he realizes this blade is magical. It creeps into his mind a bit, and it's this uncomfortable feeling. He could connect to it more, but he doesn't want to right now as he drops it. And he picks up some cloth, tears it away from the side, and he wraps up the blade. Straps it to his back. He looks around. And as he looks around, he realizes that the entire battlefield is staring at him. Doesn't entirely know why until he looks at his arms, and instead of the blue electric crackle, it in part still streams across the jets. He also sees this dull, throbbing red within all of the glyphs. And as he begins to make his way back to the circle of Thanes, the strangest thing happens. He sees as many of the dwarves around him, looking at him, take the moment and bow. Go down onto the knee and bow. And as he reaches the Thanes look at him, and with no words, all 6 of them place their weapons down and bow. His confusion is unmatched. And it overwhelms him until in his voice he hears, in his mind he hears something. And coming from out of it in his mind, he feels as his mouth opens and he says something, but what he says isn't his voice and he doesn't want to say it. As within the layered voice of 3, the 3 voices of Ashtola, he hears himself and yet not himself say, "The true king of the Highlands has returned." With that, his vision goes dark, and ahead of him, he sees himself floating above the Highlands. He sees below him a battle unfolding, one of a massive scale, not the one that he just took part in, much, much larger. And standing on one of the hills is a dwarf in incredibly ornate armor that he doesn't recognize. And as the dwarf swings this blade that he has, he watches as it cleaves through the hills themselves. And the battle is suddenly over. He sees the same landscape as these cleaves from the sword that this dwarf had made. They begin to grow over, and they begin to green again, and he looks down at the hills, and he recognizes the place as it is where he is now. He had never realized, but looking out, he sees that these pathways between the hills, these valleys, are not natural. These are the work of something, of someone, of some battle fought here long ago, and their scars reach ever still into the present. And then his vision continues as he sees once again, over these hills, with the cleaves going through them, he sees new, more and more dwarves, as he once again sees a battle commence. And this time, standing in front of him on one of the hilltops, he sees himself, in the armor he's wearing himself, as he lifts up the blade that he had just gotten. This dull, reddish blade, as he swings it, and he watches himself cleave through the hills himself. He watches as the battle unfurls, but this time, the grass doesn't grow over the battle. It remains red. The hills died forever, and he watches as much of the area begins to decay, and destroy and fall apart. With that, his vision returns, and Baeran feels himself entirely weakened, as in front of him are the Thanes, around him are the many people that had been around him in battle, and behind him, as he glances backwards, he sees the dead. But for a moment, they don't seem to be there. He doesn't see the dead as corpses. He sees, just for a brief second, their ghostly shadows on top of the corpses, kneeling to him in reverence. And with that, he feels himself black out. That is how Baeran gets the next name. Baeran Steelsinger. For his acts during the war, his cunning, and his ability to manipulate the magic of his own armor to grant himself victory. Baeran has come again, apparently. Apparently he is the true king of the Highlands, although he does not know what that means yet. I hope you all enjoyed this. Next week will come for the time being, final portion of this. His saga continues much, much longer. But for now, we're going to we're going to finish this segment of his journey, and then we'll see where else the bottles may take us. Also, for those that are interested, the other names that he could have gotten are... So the one that he got was Baeran the Steel Singer. The other names that he could have gotten were Baeran the Eastern Wind, Baeran the Tide Herald, and Baeran the Forsaken. All of those would have been really interesting. See where those would have gone. So here he is, Baeran, King of the Highlands.